Hello again, back for more Gluttons for Punishment. This week we're going to look at something I've had for quite a while, and it's really interesting, and it's more about the story and what we can trace about this thing, which is a nutmeg grater. If you've never seen one of these cylindrical, we call them, even though that's oval, cylindrical nutmeg graters, they hinge at the top. So that's where you put your nutmegs, multiple nutmegs, and then the front, it's very clever, the front folds down, and there's the grater. So you can get a nutmeg out, grate away, and that goes into punch, it goes into drinks. It's more, we think of it obviously now for baking, because the whole world has gone baking mad, but it was more about putting nutmeg in drinks and in your food to season it. A little bit like you would have, you know, if you were sort of some sort of Epicurean, you might have a little silver pepper grinder to add a little bit more pepper to your dish. You might want to add a little bit more nutmeg, either to your beverage or to the dish that you were being served, some sort of posset. So these were very personal items. That's the first thing. They're very personal things. They're things to be carried with you, rather than a nutmeg grater to keep in the kitchen. This is interesting, firstly, because it is made by Hester Bateman, which, of course, it wasn't, because Hester Bateman never made a piece of silver in her life. She was, I'm sorry if you've been collecting Bateman silver for years, imagining her with her skirts hitched up and a hammer in her hand, hammering away. She was the widow of John Bateman, who was a specialist gold chain maker. He died in 1760. And what she did, she was still a pioneer, but she took the business over and she ran it extremely well. And she turned what was a small gold chain making business into a very large London manufacturing silversmith. She begins to be recorded as a gold chain maker, a gold worker, when she immediately takes over the business. She registers her mark because her husband has died, and this happened with other goldsmiths as well. But soon she gets recorded as a spoon maker. And what she does is she runs a workshop that makes good quality, but not exceptional quality. Let's be absolutely clear about that. Good, functional, domestic silver, middle range stuff. A lot of the silver that they made is quite thin. It's often helped by machine rolling. I think Bateman were very, if we look into it in detail, we'll find that they adopted lots of the techniques of mechanisation, so they could churn things out more. This is how they became a large, successful business. Anyone that collects sugar tongs will almost instantly recognise that as a Bateman pattern of sugar tong, although we'll go back to these, but these have another maker's mark on them, which is part of the story. So Bateman produced all this silver. Obviously, when they're producing it in such large quantities, they're not directly retailing it themselves only. They're supplying other goldsmiths. And the goldsmiths they're supplying in the main are not in London, but they are provincial goldsmiths throughout England. And often you'll see pieces by Bateman supplied to the Channel Islands. They particularly made Channel Islands pieces that were overstruck by Channel Islands makers. They supplied pieces to the West Country. Often you'll find pieces, tongs like this or spoons overstruck. And this is the good thing, so we can trace it. They originally have Hester's mark on them, and then someone's obviously sent a letter saying we need, 10 pairs of tongs and, 100, 2 dozen, 5 dozen, 10 dozen teaspoons. So they send them off with their mark on because they were going to sell them anyway, if they didn't want them. And then the goldsmith at the other end will overstamp them. So Richard Evans of Shrewsbury, lots of things overstamping Hester Bateman. Thomas Ollivant of Manchester, lots of things overstriking Hester Bateman. Much rarer, much rarer. In fact, I've only seen 2 examples in my life. This is John Thompson of Sunderland overstriking Hester Bateman. And if we can, in the detailed video, I'm not sure with the sugar tongs I'll be able to get the camera in, but if we look at this mark, which is an IT for John Thompson II of Sunderland, you can actually see the HB on the raised parts of the lettering. You can still see Bateman's mark there, and these are about 1786, because Hester was working, her business was working from 1761 up to 1790, when it passed to her sons, Peter and Jonathan. We won't touch on the later period, but it went on for 4 generations. It was a big, successful business, churning out pieces that are usually decorated with bright cut engraving. Now, why is this interesting when it comes to this nutmeg grater? Well, it's interesting because this nutmeg grater, you may have seen it, you may not, has some engraving to it. And it says, if you can see it, a name, M. Langlands, and the word Newcastle. It is not, let me be clear, it is not assayed. It only has Hester Bateman's maker's mark. Now, it should have been assayed. And normally with these things, when they're marked, what happens is they're submitted for assay, and obviously they're weighed for the duty, without this grater present. That's fitted after they've come back from the assay office. So the marks will often be struck on the inside here, because this isn't here, so obviously the assayer can put it down and just strike the punches, bomb, 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 and then they'll put a part mark on the cover. I have checked this with a little mirror that goes inside. It is completely unmarked, apart from Hester Bateman's maker's mark on the lid. So basically, this would have been made, it would have had a mark appended, it wouldn't have had the grater in, and it would have been ready to go to the assay office to be struck, to be marked up, and then have this grater fitted. But if you were supplying it to another silversmith out in the provinces who had ordered it, you could leave it for them to assay the piece, because you weren't selling it directly. You were providing it, as is often described, in the white. In the white. You were providing it in a sort of partially unfinished state, to be fair, although it was a finished object. Now this, I'm sure, went up to a Newcastle goldsmith, and the Newcastle goldsmith we know that Hester Bateman had a relationship with, the Newcastle goldsmith who latterly, after Hester's retired from the business, admittedly, registered a mark in London. And I'm sure that was there so Bateman's could, they were supplying them in significant enough quality that there would be a mark there for Bateman's to use in their name at the London Assay Office to apply to goods that were being sent up, the firm of John Langlands. And you think, Langlands, well, it's engraved Langlands. What's going on? Now, why isn't it marked for Newcastle? Why hasn't Hester Bateman's mark been overstruck as a man in Sunderland would do, a man in Shrewsbury would do, a man in Manchester would do? You only needed, as a goldsmith, to submit items for assay if you were selling them. So we're working this out, aren't we? You're following the thread. I know it gets a little bit labyrinthine. If you manufactured or made or purchased in the white from another goldsmith an object that was for your personal use, you would not be obliged to have it assayed. You would not be obliged to pay the duty that was due for it being assayed. Now we're getting there. M. Langlands. Well, it was John Langlands who was the goldsmith, so it would be convenient if that was J. Langlands, and then that would explain it all. John Langlands had a wife. They all had wives. Margaret Langlands. So if this was ordered as a gift for his wife, he would not need to assay it. He would not need to countermark it. He wouldn't bother. It might damage the piece anyway. And he'd have to put that right. The only thing he would do is have it engraved in Newcastle with his wife's name, which he could do in his workshop. So this then is transformed from being a George III silver nutmeg grater, because Margaret Langlands, when her husband John died in about 1794, briefly took over the business. She briefly took over the business. Not for long. Her sons then came in and formed a partnership with other goldsmiths and carried it on. But she was, for the briefest period, another 18th century female goldsmith. This was made by the firm of another 18th century female goldsmith. As far as I can tell, and I have looked into it for a period of time, this is the only piece that we can definitely point to and say it has gone from the hands of one. It is made for one, by one female goldsmith for another. And that sort of transforms it, doesn't it? That makes it a very interesting, possibly not very important, but a very interesting piece of 18th century silver, because it tells us that story. So it does pay to do a little bit of detective work, and it pays to know about hallmarking and the reasons why things weren't hallmarked. There are exemptions for lighter objects, there are exemptions for other objects as well, but it's only because we know that this should have been hallmarked and it wasn't, that it's gone from one goldsmith to another. And because we know who that goldsmith is, and because it's engraved, we can say it's gone from Hester Bateman to Margaret Langlands, which is pretty fantastic. So that's that for today. I'll show you the engraving close up, and I'll also try and show you the overstriking here of Thompson's mark on these tongs. But until then, good antiques hunting and goodbye.